How did a nation of newly freed slaves fashion a small wooden chest overlaid with beaten gold with such precise specifications that touching it could cost a life? The question sits at the crossroads of craftsmanship, theology, and historical mystery. The Ark of the Covenant was never merely a ritual prop. The biblical account portrays it as a concentrated point of presence and authority, a tangible center where the covenant between God and Israel was materially expressed. But beyond that reverent framing, the Ark also functioned in ways that had immediate social, political, and even lethal practical consequences. In the course of this narrative, we will follow the Ark from Sinai to the Temple, examine what it was made of, who made it, how it was handled, and why its presence changed the course of battles and the lives of priests. We will weigh ancient ritual explanations and modern speculative hypotheses, and we will end where history pauses, missing in the ruins of 582 BC, its fate unresolved. On the mountain of Sinai, the instructions begin not as a vague mandate, but as architectural precision. The biblical account records that Moses received dimensions down to the cubit, length, breadth, and height, proportions that suggest a compact but weighty object. God also named the craftsman Bezalel, whose hands and mind were singled out to translate divine blueprints into physical form. Bezalel's work was not improvisational. It demanded metalworking, woodcraft, dyeing, embroidering. He did not work alone. The tradition names a skilled assistant, Oholiab, though some textual traditions vary in how that name appears. This companion should be treated as indefinite for verification against manuscript variants. The image is unmistakable, a human team, gifted and authorized, executing something meant to embody divine instruction. Imagine the workshop, desert dust tracking into a tent where strips of acacia wood are planed to uniform thickness. A skilled hand keeps a line true to the cubit, and another craftsman hammers a sheet of gold until it takes the grain of the wood beneath. Gold is not poured, it is beaten, folded, worked until a veneer covers the core. The gold itself carried meaning. It reflected light, signified the heavens in the ancient imagination, and spoke to dignity and incorruptibility. The linen, dyed purple and blue, signaled royalty and the priestly sphere. Purple dye, known later from places like Tyre, was expensive because of the labor of extracting dye from sea snails. Together, these materials communicated a theology in textures and color, an encounter between everyday human craft and the transcendent. If the material palette might appear luxurious, it also answered a practical problem.
Solid gold of the ark's dimensions would have been prohibitively heavy and vulnerable to splitting. By overlaying acacia wood with beaten gold, Israelite artisans achieved structural integrity and the reverberant, luminous surface they sought without the weight and cost of a solid metal chest. Some modern estimates suggest that depending on the gold's thickness, the finished object could have weighed in the hundreds of pounds, though exact figures vary widely with the assumptions used. The point is not the number, it is precision and intent. The Ark was designed to endure movement across deserts and campaign followings, to be both portable and sacral. But the material choices carried symbolic weight as much as they solved engineering problems. Acacia wood, hard, resistant to rot, connected the Ark to the earth from which Israel had been shaped. Gold connected it to the unchanging, to divine radiance. The fabrics, fine linen dyed violet, were visual shorthand for kingship and priesthood. Every element was prescribed, none left to casual taste. This object is at once a piece of high craftsmanship and a theological statement. Here is where heaven meets earth, in wood veiled by gold. Contained within that gilded box, according to the biblical account, were three things: the stone tablets inscribed with the law, a rod associated with Aaron that validated priestly authority, and a jar said to contain manna, the bread of provision from the wilderness. Each item expressed a facet of the covenant: law, sacramental authority, and sustaining provision. Together they are a compact theology. The law reminds Israel of covenantal obligations. The rod symbolizes delegated leadership and miraculous legitimization. The manna recalls divine sustenance in time of need. To place these objects together inside a single chest is to make the ark a concentrated sign, the memory and instruments of the covenant placed at the center of communal life. But the ark's role extended beyond symbolism into prescribed practice. The biblical text records strict protocols for its transport and handling. Poles that fit into rings on its sides were to be used by designated Levites. The ark was never to be carried by anyone not appointed. When moving, the ark was to be covered with a veil and placed on shoulder poles. Never should one touch the wood or the gold directly. The holiness attached to the object created a separation, a mediated contact between priest and presence. The biblical account frames these rules as expressions of divine holiness. The ark is sanctified, and human hands are not appropriate instruments for casual contact. Yet the narratives do not stop at rules. They record tragic, abrupt consequences for their violation. The best-known example is the man who reached out to steady the ark during a transport and was struck dead. The biblical account records the incident plainly. In the moment he touched the ark, death followed.
Why would the act of steadying a rolling box summon such a lethal response? Religious tradition takes this as an uncompromising boundary marker. Holiness cannot be handled by the uninitiated, and the communal memory stores the story as a warning to honor divine prescription. Alongside that ritual explanation, modern commentators have proposed naturalistic analogies to make sense of the lethal motif without reducing the text's theological force. Some researchers suggest that the ark's construction, a wooden core sheathed in metal, could, under very specific conditions, function as a primitive form of capacitor. Wrapped, layered, and possibly insulated or wetted in certain contexts, a metallic-faced box could, this is speculative, store and then discharge an electrical potential in ways surprising to those who touched it. This analogy is intended to elucidate rather than replace the sacred reading. It gives one possible physical mechanism that might account for sudden, localized, lethal effects. It is crucial to say plainly that such proposals are hypotheses, not proof. They are modern tools to approach ancient texts, not substitutes for the theological claims within them. But the power attributed to the ark was not only deadly, it also acted as a focal point in Israel's public life and warfare. Consider the episode at Jericho. The biblical account records a ritual strategy: priests walking before the ark, blowing trumpets, encircling the city. In that context, the ark's presence served a psychological and symbolic function. Warfare in antiquity was as much about morale as it was about weapons and walls. The visible presence of the ark among the ranks must have been a statement that the community marched under a covenantal authority. For the Israelites, to see the ark was to be assured that the law and the divine promise marched with them. For opponents, it was a portent that the conflict was not simply human. Archaeologists debate the historicity and mechanics of Jericho's collapse, but the narrative's core remains. The ark's placement in the lead of the procession turned war into a ritualized act of obedience that, according to the account, achieved dramatic results. The ark's capture and humiliation at the hands of the Philistines presents a different dimension. The biblical account records that in a battle the Israelites lost the ark, and it was taken into the house of Dagon, the Philistine god. The next morning the statue of Dagon lay prostrate before the ark. When set upright, the idol fell again, broken.
Then plagues, tumors, and afflictions befell the Philistines. Whether interpreted as a miraculous divine intervention or as a narrative crafted to show the power of Israel's God, the episode makes a clear point. The ark was not a trophy with neutral power to be appropriated by any host.
Its presence generated consequences that aligned with its covenantal identity, something the Philistines learned to their cost, returning it on a cart drawn by cows to avoid human touch. The biblical account emphasizes that the Philistines tried to treat the ark as a spoil with predictable failure. These case studies, the fatal touch, Jericho, the Philistine episode, form narrative anchors for understanding the ark's functional impact in Israelite life. They also reveal that the boundaries around the ark were enforced not just by law, but by experience, memory, and, in the texts, by calibrated, sometimes terrifying, outcomes. The ark's liturgical peak appears in the ritual calendar. On the Day of Atonement, once a year, the high priest entered the innermost sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, and performed rites of purification and reconciliation. The biblical account records careful procedures. The priest approached with incense acting as a screen, offering blood to the mercy seat that sat atop the ark. In this ritual, the ark's top surface, the mercy seat, stood as the meeting place between God and the priest who interceded on the people's behalf. The drama is concentrated. A single figure, the high priest, equipped with specified garments and rites, mediates between a holy presence and a sin-laden people. The ark thus fulfilled a legal and sacrificial function. It provided the locus where atonement was ritually enacted, where blood was presented, and where divine forgiveness was invoked. Theological scholars emphasize that this is not theater. It is an acted theology, ritualized to make audible and visible the notions of sin, sacrifice, and reconciliation embedded in the covenantal structure. Handling and transporting the ark required ritual competence. The Levites, not the priests, were charged with its physical movement. Coverings were used to obscure direct sight and contact. Staff poles remained inserted so no hand would touch the ark itself. The biblical account records punitive instances when these rules were disregarded, each a stern reminder that the object served more than memory. It demarcated authority and boundary. These protocols created a disciplined relationship between human agents and a sanctified object, enforcing a separation that carried ecclesial and social consequences. Yet the ark also had a political dimension. When King David sought to restore the ark to Jerusalem, there is an episode often noted for its complexity. During transport on a cart, someone reached out, Uzzah, a name appearing in different manuscript forms, and thus flagged here as indefinitive, to steady it, and was struck dead. David's initial joy at the ark's return is shattered into grief and fear. He then pauses, places the ark temporarily in a house, and later, after consulting, installs it more carefully in the city. The narrative suggests that the ark's presence could confer legitimacy. David's desire to bring it home is linked to national identity and royal authority, but that legitimacy demanded obedience to established ritual norms. David himself recognized the necessity of reverence and law, and the incident shaped Israel's later treatment of the ark. Beyond its liturgical and political roles, the ark's later history carries a long, unresolved mystery. In 586 BC, the Babylonians, under Nebuchadnezzar, destroyed Solomon's temple and carried off spoils, but curiously, the Babylonian record is silent on the ark itself. This silence has become a central puzzle. One possibility is that the ark was destroyed or dismantled in the conflagration, melted down or lost in the chaos, an outcome the archaeological record might show if we had uncontested artifacts, but which lacks direct corroboration. Another possibility, which many scholars find plausible, is that the ark was hidden before the assault, concealed in subterranean chambers beneath the temple, or whisked away by priests to a secure location within Jerusalem. This theory gains traction precisely because powerful religious communities have often taken steps to protect their most sacred objects in the face of threat. Yet the Temple Mount is archaeologically and politically sensitive. Modern excavations are limited, and unauthorized digs are both illegal and culturally fraught. For that reason, direct archaeological confirmation remains elusive. A third line of tradition points further afield: Ethiopia. For centuries, an Ethiopian Christian tradition has maintained that the ark rests in the Church of St. Mary of Zion in Aksum, guarded by a single monk. This claim is historically rich and deeply significant for Ethiopian identity, but it exists largely outside of independent archaeological verification. The tradition is influential and should not be dismissed. It is one of many strands that make the ark's story global rather than local. A fourth strand involves a mixture of modern fascination, rumor, and even geopolitical obsession. The 19th and 20th centuries witnessed increased interest from explorers, collectors, and, at times, political regimes fascinated with relics and symbols of power. There are documented cases of organized searches and, in the extreme, episodes where esoteric collections intersected with political agendas. These modern quests reflect not just curiosity, but global cultural hunger for tangible links to sacred pasts. Yet they also raise ethical questions. Who has the right to search, to excavate, to display? The ark's possible resting place sits at the center of contested narratives and legal restrictions, particularly when considering the sanctity of sites such as the Temple Mount. Archaeological evidence in the classical sense is thin. The absence of Babylonian mention of the ark is telling. Empires often recorded plunder as trophies.
That lack leaves open interpretation. Either the ark was not taken as a spoil, or Babylonian chroniclers had reasons to omit it. Theories that propose hidden chambers under Jerusalem draw on historical precedent. Cities often hid treasures, but face the practical reality that the Temple Mount today is a politically sensitive religious complex where large-scale excavations are prohibited. Scholars who argue for concealment point to textual hints and the practical likelihood that priests sought to preserve what mattered most. Others are less certain, weighing the options with historiographical caution. If we return to the functional heart of the question, what was the ark really for? We find an answer that is complex but coherent. The ark's true purpose was simultaneously theological, juridical, and social. The biblical account frames it as the place where God's presence met Israel, the mercy seat as a throne, the tablets as the covenantal law, the rod as sign of priestly authority, and the manna as memory of sustenance. In ritual practice, the ark mediated between the divine and the human. It was a site of atonement, a focus of prayer, and an object of public ceremony. In political life, it conferred legitimacy. Kings sought it, armies paraded it, enemies feared it. Its presence shaped decisions and inspired obedience or punished transgression. That duality, symbol and functional instrument, defines the ark's true purpose. It was not a magic box in a modern sense, nor merely an object to be revered from afar. It was a constructed, enacted center of a people's covenantal life. This interpretation does not close the door on other meaningful ways to understand sudden phenomena tied to the ark. Some scholars and modern investigators offer technical analogies, capacitor-like layers, potential for stored charge, or physical hazards introduced by metallic sheathing and moisture as complementary frameworks to examine specific lethal accounts. These ideas are speculative tools for inquiry. They should be treated as imaginative reconstructions rather than definitive explanations. The ancient texts themselves place primary emphasis on holiness and ritual patterning. Even if a natural mechanism lay behind some reported effects, the community framed those effects theologically within a worldview that did not separate the sacred from the everyday. There are still practical ramifications to consider. If the Ark were ever to be found today, the questions would multiply. Who would be permitted to handle it, and under what authority? Would its discovery rekindle religious devotion, scholarly inquiry, political claims? History suggests that sacred artifacts become nodes of contested meaning, attracting those who seek to use them for devotion, scholarship, or even national storycraft. Any modern encounter with the Ark would thus require careful ethical, legal, and religious deliberation.
We must also remember a practical restraint. There is no responsible way to encourage or instruct in archaeological digs at sensitive sites like the Temple Mount. Legal protections, cultural sensitivities, and international guidelines limit intrusive searches. These constraints must be respected. The Ark's disappearance remains one of history's great open questions. Whether it was destroyed, hidden beneath layers now off-limits to excavation, spirited away to foreign soil, or simply lost in the chaos of war, the lack of direct evidence coaxes historians to combine textual exegesis, cautious archaeological inference, and respectful attention to tradition. The mystery endures not merely because of physical absence, but because the Ark's presence, real or imagined, continues to shape identities and memories. Consider the human element. Priests trained to perform rites that conferred communal reconciliation, Levites schooled in the discipline of transport, kings who sought the Ark to build political theology, and common people who lined the streets to see their symbol. These are not abstractions. They are living practices that created and carried the Ark's meaning. The prohibition on touch, the ceremonial insertion of poles, the single annual entry by a high priest, all these practices structured a society's relation to the sacred. The Ark thus helped to form institutions, centralized cultic authority, priestly hierarchy, and a sense that law and divine presence were embodied and enforceable. It is worth returning to the psychological dimension in warfare. Battles are not decided only by walls and spears, but by confidence and the narrative of who stands with you. The Ark functioned as a mobile emblem of why a people fought. At Jericho, the ritualized procession transformed a military approach into an act of obedience. At other times, the Ark's capture demoralized and humiliated, as the Philistines briefly experienced. In these moments, the Ark's potency lay at the intersection of belief and practice. Belief that the covenant had real consequences, and practice that ritualized that belief in the public sphere. Finally, to ask whether the Ark was a weapon is to misunderstand both ancient sensibilities and the Ark's complex role. The biblical narratives never present the Ark as a manufactured armament. They present it as a covenantal center whose presence had practical effects. Where those effects seem to resemble power, toppling walls, inflicting plagues, they are framed as expressions of divine justice and boundary. Modern comparisons to weapons are anachronistic and risk mischaracterizing the theological and communal dynamics the texts intend. So, what would finding the Ark mean today? It would be a discovery drenched in religious emotion,
scholarly reevaluation, political sensitivity, and ethical complexity. It would force contemporary institutions, religious, academic, governmental, to navigate custody, interpretation, and ritual accommodation.
It would challenge us to hold together reverence for tradition and rigorous historical inquiry. And it would remind us that ancient objects are not inert relics, but active participants in human meaning-making. The Ark's true purpose, as we have followed it from Sinai to silence, emerges as a layered answer. It was built to be a meeting place of presence and law, a liturgical instrument for atonement, a marker of priestly and royal authority, and a social symbol that altered morale and conduct. The stories of lethal touch, of triumph at Jericho, of the Philistine humiliation, and of the guarded rituals on the Day of Atonement all point to the same conclusion. The Ark mediated a relationship between the divine and the communal life of Israel in ways that could not be reduced to either myth or mere object. The mystery remains of where the Ark went when the temple fell. Scholars continue to debate, and archaeologists continue to work within the limits the present age imposes. Ancient tradition and modern investigation rub against each other, producing hypotheses and sometimes heated speculation, but no definitive answer. For now, the Ark stands at the intersection of faith, history, and mystery. Its true purpose revealed not as a single definitive function, but as a composite, theological presence, ritual instrument, and social-political focal point. If this account of origins and craftsmanship has stirred your curiosity, the story continues in the place the Ark last found a monumental home, the temple built by Solomon. That structure shaped how the Ark was housed and how the ritual world around it developed. Watch the next video that explores Solomon's temple in depth, where architecture, ritual, and royal ideology come together to establish the Ark's final known sanctuary. Until then, reflect on what this small gilded chest meant for an ancient people and what it might mean to us now. An object that made a people's deepest convictions tangible, that disciplined behavior through law and ritual, and that continues to remind us that objects can hold more than their material parts. They can hold the memory of a people's encounter with the sacred. If you found this investigation illuminating, subscribe for more historical deep dives and follow the next episode on Solomon's Temple to see where the Ark's story next leads.